سلام بر شما بینندگان عزیز تلویزیون آپادانا اینترنشنال در هر کجای این کره خاکی که این تصویر و صدا رو میبینید. فرامرز فروزنده هستم و خوشحالم که یک بار دیگه این شانس رو دارم تا با شما باشم در برنامه نسیم شمال. اجازه فرمایید که ابتدا خدمتتون بگم برنامه امشب فکر میکنم برای کسانی که اهل این نوع برنامه هستند برنامه فوق‌العاده باید جالبی باشد، چرا که دو بخش اصلی برنامه داره. در یکی از بخش‌های این برنامه من شما رو به سنای آمریکا میبرم، جلسه بسیار مهمی که روز سه‌شنبه گذشته در رابطه با مسائل ایران در کمیته روابط خارجی سنای آمریکا برگزار شد و آقای ریچارد آرمیتاژ معاون وزیر امور خارجه آمریکا و مسئول امور ایران در این وزارتخانه به سوالات 6 تن از سناتورها در رابطه با ایران توضیح داد. البته این جلسه چند ساعته‌ای بود. من از مجموعه اونچه که در جلسه گذشته است حدود فکر می‌کنم که 40 دقیقه برای شما خلاصه کردم، مهمترین قسمت‌هاش رو تا در قسمت اول برنامه امشب اونها رو شما ببینید و خیلی تعجب می‌کنم که هیچ کدوم از این تلویزیون‌ها تا اونجایی که من اطلاع دارم به این جلسه نپرداختند. اما در قسمت دوم برنامه امشب این افتخار نصیب من شده است که یکی از ارزنده‌ترین و یکی از ارجمندترین بانوان ایران که در راه آزادی و حقوق بشر در ایران فعالیت می کنند و سالهای سال هست در این زمینه تلاش می کنند، امشب افتخار دادند به محل استودیوی آپادانا اینترنشنال آمدند و برای انجام این گفتگو از شرق امریکا به غرب امریکا رنج سفر رو پذیرفتند که من همینجا قبل از اینکه ایشون به محل استودیو تشریف بیارند وظیفه خودم میدونم از طرف مدیریت آپادانا اینترنشنال و همینطور خودم به عنوان تهیه کننده برنامه نسیم شمال از این بانوی بزرگوار، یعنی بانو مهرانگیز کار، بانو دکتر مهرانگیز کار، فعال و مبارز حقوق بشر در ایران، قدردانی و تشکر بکنم به خاطر لطف بزرگی که کردند. خانم دکتر مهرانگیز کار به مجرد اینکه برسند و ما بتونیم در خدمتشون باشیم برنامه رو آغاز میکنیم، اما حدود فکر میکنم ساعت 8 شب گفتگوی من با خانم مهرانگیز کار شروع خواهد شد و شما بینندگان عزیز هم میتوانید اگر پرسش هایی از خانم دکتر کار داشته باشید اونها رو مطرح بکنید. فکس تلویزیون باز هست، تلفن ها باز هست و من بیشتر تشویقتون میکنم از فکس استفاده بکنید، چرا که شانس کسانی که از فکس تلویزیون استفاده میکنند در مقایسه با تلفن ها بیشتره. در دفعات قبل ما اولویت رو به تلفن ها میدادیم ولی مواجه با اعتراض بینندگان عزیز خودمون شدیم. این بار سعی میکنیم که این اشتباه رو جبران بکنیم، همراه با فکس تلفن ها رو جواب بدیم و در واقع حق کسانی که فکس میکنند ندیده گرفته نشود. اما هفته آینده در روز شنبه در دانشگاه برکلی به مناسبت 50 سالگرد کودتای 28 مرداد یک کنفرانس یک روزه به زبان انگلیسی برگزار میشه که دکتر سیروس بینا، دکتر منصور فرهنگ و نیکی کدی در اون سخنرانی میکنند. این برنامه از ساعت 6 تا 10 شب هست و در اتاق 2050 ولی لایف ساینس بیلدینگ دانشگاه برکلی برگزار میشه. برگزار کنندگان این برنامه رادیو KPFA و دپارتمان تاریخ و مطالعات خاورمیانه دانشگاه برکلی و گروه دانشجویان ایرانی دانشگاه برکلی هستند و تلفن برای تماس تلفن آقای شهرام آقامیر هست، تلفن 510 501 1057 که در هفته آینده برگزار خواهد شد. اما اجازه فرمایید که نکته دیگری رو هم فکر میکنم ضرورت داره من قبل از اینکه برنامه رو آغاز بکنم و اجزایش رو به اطلاع شما برسونم شروع بکنیم وارد دیتیل برنامه بشویم، اونها رو باید با شما مطرح بکنم. ما هفته گذشته یک جلسه داشتیم در محل تلویزیون که این جلسه بنا به پیشنهاد آقای ستار دلدار تشکیل شده بود، متشکل از همه کسانی بود که در این تلویزیون فعالیت دارن، دعوت شده بودن در این جلسه باشن و به ما در اون جلسه گفته شد، به ماها که افرادی شبیه من که همکاران افتخاری این تلویزیون هستند و داوطلبانه با تلویزیون همکاری میکنن و همینطور همه کادر موظف تلویزیون، این چنین گفته شد که تلویزیون با یک بحران مالی مواجه هست و همه برنامه ها باید دارای اسپانسر باشند، حمایت کننده مالی داشته باشند و این حمایت مالی باید در واقع تلویزیون رو در تأمین هزینه های خودش یاری بکنه. بسیار امر قابل درک و قابل فهمی هست، ولی من فکر میکنم که اون چیزی که به ما گفتند این بود که برنامه ها تا 15 نوامبر به روال سابق خودش ادامه پیدا میکنه و بعد از 15 نوامبر تمامی برنامه هایی که دارای حامی مالی نباشند این برنامه ها قطع خواهد شد و جای خودشون رو به برنامه هایی خواهند داد که حامی مالی داشته باشند و بتوانند تلویزیون رو در مورد هزینه های آنتن تلویزیون و اونچه که خرج تلویزیون هست یاری بکنند. من برای شما مجموعه برنامه‌هایی رو که تدارک دیدم حتی برای بعد از 15 نوامبر خدمتتون عرض می‌کنم. اگر که برای برنامه اسپانسر مالی پیدا شد که این در واقع دعوت من هست که یک از همه برنامه‌های تلویزیون حمایت بکنید، برنامه‌ها رو انتخاب بکنید، اسپانسر مالیشون بشید، حمایت کننده مالیشون بشید، برنامه‌هایی رو که باشون موافق هستید. من فکر کنم همه برنامه‌ها رو باید این کار رو کرد و تلویزیون آپادانا رو در کوشش خودش یاری بکنید تا بتواند برنامه‌های پرطرفدار و پربیننده خودش رو حفظ بکنه و این برنامه‌ها به دلیل عدم توانایی مالی حذف نشن. از جمله این برنامه‌ها یکی همین برنامه نسیم شمال هست. اما اجازه فرمایید که من مجموعه برنامه‌هایی رو که دارم برای شما خدمتتون عرض بکنم تا ببینید اگر مایل بودید شاید این در تصمیم گیریتون برای پیدا کردن حامی مالی برای برنامه نسیم شمال مؤثر باشد. در غیر این صورت هم هفته آینده اگر حمایت کننده مالی پیدا نشه، هفته آینده آخرین برنامه نسیم شمال پخش خواهد شد و از در واقع 16 نوامبر به بعد شما تصویر بنده رو روی تلویزیون نخواهید داشت مگر اینکه حامی مالی وجود داشته باشه. اجازه فرمایید عناوین برنامه ها رو عرض بکنم تا می شود گفت تا پایان سال 2003 چه گفتگوهایی دارم، چه قسمت‌هایی در برنامه من هست، اینها رو خدمتتون عرض می‌کنم. هفته آینده 9 نوامبر نگاهی خواهیم داشت به روابط ایران و آمریکا و موقعیت امریکا در منطقه و تجزیه و تحلیل جلسه سنای امریکا با حضور 2 تن از اساتید برجسته ایرانی دانشگاه‌های امریکا، دکتر منصور فرهنگ و دکتر سیروس بینا. در 16 نوامبر گفتگویی دارم با خانم فروغ داموس، نویسنده کتاب فانی این فارسی، کتاب بسیار جالب و پرطرفداری که این روزها به قول امریکایی‌ها ریویوهای متعدد گرفته و سخت مورد استقبال قرار گرفته و جوانها و نوجوانهای ایرانی مقیم امریکا دستشون کتاب فانی این فارسی هست. در قسمت دوم برنامه 16 نوامبر من آقای علیرضا نظمی دبیرکل جبهه ملی آذربایجان در برنامه حضور خواهند داشت و به گفتگو با ایشون درباره هدف‌های جبهه ملی آذربایجان خواهم پرداخت. در 23 نوامبر در قسمت اول برنامه گفتگویی دارم با آقای دکتر مسعود نقره‌کار در رابطه با تاریخ و جنبش روشنفکری ایران. در قسمت دوم برنامه گفتگویی دارم با آقای دکتر داریوش امیراحمدی درباره دستگیری دکتر داریوش زاهدی در تهران و اینکه هنوز او در زندان اوین هست. به هر حال بعد از این برنامه 23 نوامبر در 30 نوامبر شما رو دعوت میکنم اگر حمایت کننده مالی برنامه داشت به یک مناظره بی‌نظیر در تاریخ وسایل ارتباط جمعی بنشینید. میهمان حضوری من حجت الاسلام محمد هدایتی است و مهمان تلفنی من از استرالیا هومر آبرامیان هست که درباره رابطه زن و مرد و موضوع ازدواج در اسلام با هم مناظره خواهند کرد. در 7 دسامبر در قسمت اول برنامه یادواره‌ای خواهد بود از دکتر امیرحسین آریانپور و در قسمت دوم برنامه گفتگو دارم با خانم دکتر کاتوزیان یا خانم هایسه جوادی درباره کتاب از سپیده تا شام و خاطرات خانم کاتوزیان از انقلاب ایران. در 14 دسامبر گفتگویی دارم با آقای هومر آبرامیان درباره زرتشت و اوستا که گفتگوی جالبی هست. در 21 دسامبر یکی از برجسته‌ترین شخصیت‌های فرهنگی و ادبی معاصر ایران در محل تلویزیون آپادانا اینترنشنال حضور خواهد یافت و به بحثی درباره نقش روشنفکران در تاریخ تحولات اجتماعی ایران خواهیم پرداخت. شاید نگاه دقیق‌تری داشته باشیم در این برنامه به کارهای به خصوص جلال آل احمد. این مجموعه است که تا پایان سال 2003 برای شما تدارک دیدم. امیدوارم اون رو بپسندید. همه اینها بعد از 15 نوامبر در گرو حمایت مالی شما از برنامه‌های تلویزیون آپادانا از جمله برنامه نسیم شمال هست که حمایت مالیتون رو باید به طور مشخص از برنامه اعلام بکنید. در این مورد میتونید با من یا آقای نهیتی ذوالفقاری که مسئول این پروژه هستند تماس بگیرید. تلفن من روی صفحه هست ولی تلفن آقای مهدی ذوالفقاری 408 307 85 68 است. در همین شروع برنامه من خیلی صحبت کردم. اجازه بدید بهتون بگم که در کنار مسائل جدی برنامه امشب 3 قطعه موسیقی پاپ امروز ایران هست. از بهترین هاش برای شما انتخاب کردم. اجازه بفرمایید تا قبل از اینکه به سنای امریکا بریم، شما برای اینکه بعد از برنامه طولانی فروش فرش و این حرفای طولانی بنده یک تمدد اعصابی بکنید، بریم به ایران، پای موزیک بسیار زیبای گروه آریان بنشینیم و قطعه‌ای که از آخرین کنسرت این گروه برای شما انتخاب کردم. خوش رنگ و بویی رنگ خدایی ماهی و اختر در کهکشانی در هر مکانی در هر زمانی یاری توانا بقا توانی تصویر روحی آرامشانی ای شاه مردان علی عرفان مولا علی جان مولا علی جان ای شاه مردان علی عرفان مولا علی جان مولا علی جان. بر هر ضعیفی پشت و پناهی نور چراغی بر هر سیاهی روشن دلم با یک نگاهی گم کرده ره را سرار راهی ای آفتاب عالم فروزان هم مرد مسجد هم مرد میدان گردن نهادی بر حکم یزدان تازه بسازی آیات قرآن تازه بسازی آیات قرآن ای شاه مردان علی عرفان مولا علی جان مولا علی جان ای شاه مردان علی عرفان مولا علی جان مولا علی جان. گاهی اوقات که نه، من خیلی اشتباه میکنم، مثل اینکه دقیقه انتخاب شده روی CD رو غلط انتخاب کرده بودم و قطعه دیگری پخش شد. به هر حال این قطعه هم در نوع خودش جالب بود و به نظرم میرسه که قطعه مجوز تولید CD بود که شما اون رو شنیدید. قطعی نبود که من انتخاب کرده بودم. اشتباه از اتاق فرمان نبود، اشتباه از خود من بود که دقیقه رو درست یادداشت نکردم. به هر حال پیش میاد از این اشتباهات. و اما هفته گذشته در روز سه‌شنبه کمیته روابط خارجی سنای امریکا یک جلسه چند ساعته در رابطه با ایران داشت. جلسه فوق‌العاده مهمی بود و جلسه جالبی بود که از شبکه خبری اجلاس‌های عمومی در تلویزیون‌های امریکا یعنی CSPN PN پخش شد و چند ساعت بود این جلسه. من از این جلسه خلاصه ای رو تهیه کردم که پرسش و پاسخ هست بین آقای ریچارد آرمیتاژ و 6 تن از سناتورهای امریکایی عضو کمیته روابط خارجی سنای امریکا که در واقع جوهر مطلب در این پرسش و پاسخ ها هست. این رو برای شما پخش میکنم. بر ترجمهش به اون شکل نمی کنم، برای اینکه اگر من بخوام ترجمه بکنم باید بیام روی صدای اصلی و فکر میکنم که عده بسیار زیادی از بینندگان ما متن رو به زبان انگلیسی به خوبی متوجه میشن. در پایان هر پرسش و پاسخ بنده خدمتتون میرسم، شاید عصاره اون مطلبی رو که گفته شده خدمتتون خواهم گفت. برمیگردیم و قسمت بعد رو برای شما پخش میکنیم، اما ترجمه در واقع تحت لفظی و کلمه به کلمه انجام نخواهد شد، فقط به خاطر این است که کسانی اگر هستن که هیچ انگلیسی نمیدونن لااقل جوهر مطلب رو درک بکنن که در جلسه چه گذشته است. اجازه فرمایید که با همکاری دوستان خودم شهریار و کارگردان فنی برنامه داریای گل که زحمت کارگردانی این برنامه مشکل رو در یک شب‌ها بر عهده داره با هم به سنای امریکا بریم. بهتون توصیه میکنم اگه علاقمند هستید که بعداً خودتون روی این پرسش پاسخات دقت بیشتری بکنید، این گفتگوها رو ضبط فرمایید. خیلی برداشت‌های دست اول و دقیقی رو در رابطه با ایران شما می‌بینید که سناتورهای امریکایی ارائه میدن. بریم با هم به سنای امریکا.
Is that our policy?
No, sir.
What is our policy?
Our policy is to try to eliminate the ability of Iran to carry forward with disruptive policies such as the development of WMD, such as the abandonment and the human rights, such as repression against minorities, such as religious repression against the Baha'is, and to try to get them to eschew their state sponsorship of terrorism. And in this regard, our policy is to continue to support openly and publicly the aspirations of the people of Iran for transparency, anti-corruption, and democracy.
I noted in your written statement, which I did have an opportunity to look at, you mentioned areas of common interest where we need to pursue those. I know Secretary Powell has said on various occasions the same thing and talked a little bit about possibilities of dialogue, and that's the question. When, where could you envision some official dialogue beginning with Iran?
Let me say that we've had some dialogue generally under the UN auspices, and of course we carry on a continued exchange of information through the Swiss, who are protecting power force. Certainly the three that come to mind immediately are the continued efforts in Afghanistan, where to some extent we share some common interests. The second is obviously in Iraq, where, as we've seen, and I'll be glad to go into later, they're somewhat schizophrenic about our activities. And third, one that we, I think, share an almost absolute commonality of views is on the questions of narcotics. They have a large and growing product. They are the transportation route through from Afghanistan, or one of them, up through to Central Europe, and it's something that at the proper time, when we feel it's in our interest, we could engage them.
How would you envision that might happen? I know we've had, as you noted, some dialogue through UN, third party, the Swiss, other approaches, vehicles, but and you might even frame this up a little bit, Mr. Secretary, in recent experiences that we've had with North Korea, how this might develop, or is it worthy of pursuit with Iran?
This is an unsatisfactory answer, Mr. Hagel. I think it's probably something that will be decided at the time and the place, certainly in consultation with the President. He's going to want to be involved in this decision. I think initially my own view is that it should be somewhat multilateral. We have, I think, recently found the effectiveness of that approach, and I think we would continue that at some point in time. On one-off issues, we should deal with them, but that's a decision the Secretary and the President will make. I was trying to make the point in my opening statement that we're not opposed to that. We're not saying no. We realize that there are areas in which our interest can be served by a dialogue.
You mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, obviously common interests there, not always parallel or the same as defined by each of those countries and by us, the United States.
Should I be asking?
How would you rate the Iranian behavior, cooperation, intentions, motives today versus earlier in cooperating with the United States in Afghanistan, in Iraq? Are they undermining our efforts? Are they playing different tracks? There was significant evidence early on regarding Afghanistan that they were helpful. So if you could elaborate on those two areas. Thank
yes, sir. On Iraq, it's a mixed picture. On the plus side of the ledger, I think, would be the almost immediate acknowledgement and welcoming of the Governing Council of Iraq. They have good relations with many of them. 13, of course, of the Governing Council are Shia. They pledged money in Madrid, and it's a little confusing how much, because it looks like a bit of tax credits for their businessmen and maybe some swaps in Iraq, but that's not a bad thing. They share with us one absolute common view, is they don't want a bordering state to be one of Sunni extremism, and that's one that we absolutely share as well. They have done some other positive things that are urging. They dismantled some Iranian guard posts, for lack of a better term, that were on the Iraqi side of the border and removed them back to Iran. The negative side of things is that they continue to have some of their intelligence officers and others come across the border from Iran into Iraq. We believe that they are intent on liaising with their own favorite Shia group, the Skiri, and they have activities with the Badr Corps, which we frown upon. Ambassador Bremer, from time to time, has publicly called for Iran to cease and desist that type of activity. So it's very mixed there. In Afghanistan, it's also quite mixed. On the question of narcotics, they're dead on with us. They're suffering a lot, and they share that view. They did almost immediately, in the wake of our attack, disavow the Taliban. And at that time, they disavowed al-Qaeda, but we have seen that over time that al-Qaeda has been able to weasel their way back in a bit with the Iranians for reasons best known only to the Iranians. The question of the Iranian interference in Herat is a real one. And the jury's still out on that. I know it's of some concern to Mr. Karzai and his colleagues.
Please said when.
بله، سناتور چاک هاگل سوالاتی رو که کرد شما شنیدید و پاسخهای آقای آرمیتاژ رو هم شنیدید. ریچارد آرمیتاژ یک شخصیت مطلع در رابطه با ایران است و در شروع این گفتگوی طولانی اشاره میکنه به سالهایی که ایرانی ها میگویند سالهای طلایی دوران پادشاه فقید ایران و ریچارد آرمیتاژ در ایران بوده است. از او میپرسند درباره اینکه به هر حال آیا هدف ایالات متحده امریکا تغییر رژیم در ایران هست و آرمیتاژ پاسخ میداد خیر، ما چنین هدفی رو تعقیب نمی کنیم، ما هدفهای مردم ایران و آرزوهای مردم ایران رو در واقع تعقیب میکنیم. ما به دنبال این هستیم که مبارزه بکنیم با توسعه و رشد تولید سلاح‌های کشتار جمعی در ایران توسط دولت ایران. ما میخوایم دولت ایران رو ملزم بکنیم به رعایت حقوق بشر در ایران و کاهش فشار بر اقلیت‌های مختلف از جمله باهایی‌ها و اونچه که مورد خواست مردم ایران هست رعایت دموکراسی و مردم سالاری و کثرت‌گرایی در ایران. در جای دیگری سناتور میپرسه که آیا شما با ایران در حال گفتگو هستید یا گفتگوهایی قرار هست انجام بشه؟ سناتور آقای آرمیتاژ معاون وزیر امور خارجه امریکا میگوید که ما به ترتیبی در گفتگو با ایران بوده ایم از طریق سازمان ملل متحد به خصوص در رابطه با افغانستان و عراق به نحوی این گفتگوها در جریان بوده است. درباره تمایلات و همخوانی تمایلات ایران در افغانستان و عراق از او میپرسند و میگوید که در رابطه با عراق حقیقتش اونچه که ایرانی ها تعقیب میکنن خیلی برای ما در بعضی از موارد روشن نیست یا برخوردی است که به هر حال برخورد یک سویه و روشنی از دید ما به حساب نمیاد. اونها که نمیخوان یک دولت سنی افراطی در عراق بر سر کار بیاد، این همون مطلبی است که ما هم در واقع نمیخوایم که در عراق اتفاق بیفته و در افغانستان برخورد باز به همین نحو است. در زمینه مبارزه با مواد مخدر تقریبا خط مشی‌هایی رو که ایران تعقیب کرده کاملا با خط مشی ما همسو و همجهت بوده است و ما مشکلی نداشتیم، ولی در مسئله مداخله ایران در مورد هرات کاملا این مطلب همکنون تحت بررسی و رسیدگی است و چنین مداخلاتی در هرات توسط ایران انجام می شود. اجازه بدین که بریم و سنای امریکا و نماینده دیگری رو گوش بدیم. من همینجا که دارم با شما نگاه میکنم دارم ترجمه میکنم، میبخشید از نارسایی ترجمه، فقط میخوام برای اون کسانی که اصلا نمیدونن بخشهایی از این مطلب رو راقل دستگیرشون بشیم.
I ain't got a gripe with the Viet Cong. And here as we analyze what's our gripe with Iran, you say we seek to counter the government of Iran's negative and destructive policies and actions, and then later articulate those destructive policies and actions as human rights record, pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, also interference in the Arab-Israeli peace process. So obviously this is very important to our relationship with Iran. And can you tell us where we are in the Arab-Israeli peace process?
We have nothing in front of us but the road map, but I think anybody would have to acknowledge it. That's a very rutted and bumpy map at present. We are waiting for the government of Abu Allah to be totally formed. I don't know if it will be. November 3rd is the date it has to be done. And until that happens, and until Mr. Arafat empowers that government to actually move meaningfully in the security area, then I don't think we have much reason for optimism. We stay involved. We have John Wolf's colleagues. Mr. Wolf is back here consulting with us, but his colleagues are still active and present for duty, hoping that things will get a little better. We continue our discussions with the quartet. This is of enormous interest not only to our president, but also...
The Iranian point of view, obviously they'd be concerned. Nothing's happening. We have no involvement. For what you just said, Ambassador Wolf's not there. Meanwhile, in today's news, Prime Minister Sharon's okaying the provision of services to some illegal outposts. Kind of a new break. Palestinians are naturally objecting vociferously that this is a break in the roadmap process. Do we have a position on today's news and what Prime Minister Sharon is doing? Are we involved at all?
Yeah, we're involved in fairly intense discussions with Israel, with the Prime Minister and his colleagues, both with the Secretary, who is in very often contact with the Foreign Minister colleague, and as well as Dr. Rice, who's involved, as you would know, with her counterparts and colleagues. We find some of these activities, such as the provision of services to outposts and the development of the so-called fence, to be very problematic, and it's making it somewhat more difficult. Having said that, Israel, 2.5 years of living frightened, and the very real specter of deaths and horrible maimings of women and children, I think it's understandable why they are so neuralgic on the issue. And if it was easy, it would have been solved quite a while ago. If I might, I think I don't want to leave you with a misimpression. I think Iran, not only for present support of terrorism, involved that on the 23rd of October we passed something that meant a lot to me, and that was the Beirut bombing, Marine barracks bombing of 1983. People often forget there are also two embassy bombings that Imad Mughniya, sponsored by Iran, was involved in. And there are sanctions, there are prices to pay for that kind of behavior, in my view, sir.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think it would be naive for anyone to think that it would be easy. Of course not. It's not going to be easy. And perception, I think, here and in the Arab world, and it's not tangential. We're having a hearing on Iran security. I think it is important, as you say in your written statement, these issues, these are the gripes that we have with the Iranian government. They're interfering with the peace process. But when you look at it from their point of view, the peace process is disintegrating. And even from your testimony here, Condoleezza Rice may be over there talking. Ambassador Wolf's people are there. He's not even in the region. He's our point person for the roadmap. He's not even there. And I don't believe that there's any plans to send him back. It's disintegrating and it's irrelevant to what's happening in Iran, if not, and the region, Iraq also.
You know, sir, just a technical clarification. Mr. Wolf is the head of the monitoring mission, and he's not the point person for the roadmap, but that's for better or worse, Secretary Powell on that. I'm not sure I understood the thrust of your question. If the Iranians don't see any motion either, it's the Iranians who are disrupting through terrorism the ability to have a meaningful dialogue between a government of the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. So if they would cease their support for Hezbollah, who lobbed 60 or 70 mortar rounds in yesterday, Hamas, PIJ, and PFLP-GC, I think that you would immediately see that a relative quiet would descend on the area, and perhaps we could have the dialogue. At least those who are so keen to have movement towards the Palestinians would then have a much better leg on which to argue their point of view.
I wouldn't dispute what you said about our abhorrence of some of what's happening on the other side, but meanwhile, nothing's happening, they might argue, on the side of Israeli agreements to the roadmap. And that's my question to you. What's happening? Where are we doing on that side? And from what I've heard so far, absolutely nothing.
I would respectfully dispute the nothing, but I think that, as I said, we've had some problematic actions by the government of Israel in the wake of no action and no ability to have the Palestinian Authority unleashed, the security forces unleashed against those.
And so...
سناتور رودایلند در واقع اعتراضش یا پرسشش در رابطه با سیاست غیر فعال آمریکا در مناقشه عرب و اسرائیل بود و او در این باره آقای آرمیتاژ رو زیر سوال برد و سوء استفاده و بهره برداری ایران از این سیاست غیر فعال رو. آرمیتاژ معتقد است که سیاست آمریکا در مناقشه عرب و اسرائیل و فلسطینی ها یک سیاست غیر فعال نیست و دولت امریکا، وزیر امور خارجه امریکا در ارتباط تنگاتنگ با آقای آریل شارون و وزیر امور خارجه اسرائیل هست و توجه سناتور امریکایی رو جلب می‌کند به درک عصبیت اسرائیلی‌ها که در طول چند سال گذشته به زعم او شاهد کشتار زنان و مردان و اطفال بیگناه اسرائیلی بودند. سناتور امریکایی معتقد است که ایران با درک اینکه آمریکا دارای یک سیاست فعال در منطقه نیست از شرایط موجود بهره برداری میکنه. حالا اجازه بفرمایید که پای صحبت‌های آقای جوزف بایدن، یکی از سناتورهای برجسته امریکایی، بنشینیم و ببینیم ایشون در رابطه با ایران چه پرسش‌هایی رو مطرح میکنه.
The things that I've been trying to discern is how much of in an international sense, the antisocial behavior of the Iranian government is a consequence of their feeling isolated and from a purely self-interest point of view, the conclusion is reached that they have to do certain things. For example, I can remember, I hate to admit it, I was here when the Shah was there. From the Shah on, Iran has been seeking nuclear weapons, including the Shah. The idea that the continued pursuit of nuclear weapons, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, and I really am not, the idea suggested by some that the pursuit of nuclear weapons is part of an extremist Muslim Shia clerical leadership that somehow is different than has been the instinct of every government that I've been aware of since I got here in 1973 is somewhat misleading. Now, they may have different designs on the potential, on the reasons why they want a nuclear capability. And one of the things we don't often examine, at least out loud, is whether or not there is any potential for a grand security bargain with the Iranians that might serve their purposes as well as ours. When I say there, that's even problematic. Who's they? Because there is this internal dispute. But one thing everybody seems pretty well set on, whether they are, quote, democratic reformers or they are the Ayatollahs, is the desire for Iran to have weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. And so I'm wondering, I don't expect a specific answer, but a generic answer. Are there folks at State and Defense, the National Security Agency, that have examined this in the overall context of U.S. Iranian relations, as opposed to specifically their initiatives on weapons of mass destruction, their initiatives with regard to terrorist organizations, their initiatives with regard to Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera? Because if you were sitting in Tehran, whether you're a democratic government or you are the supreme leader for whom democracy is antithetical to everything that he thinks, there are certain sort of imperatives. They are at the moment surrounded by forces that seem somewhat hostile to them. Our assertions have been very straightforward about the threat we think they pose to the region and to us. I'm not suggesting that justifies any of their actions. I'm just trying to figure out what are the broad policy prescriptions that have been debated internally within the administration, other than what seems to be essentially one of two options. Either we contain them, but containment only works if we have really wide international support for that containment. And obviously the Europeans have concluded that it's better to take a shot at trusting but verifying, to use Reagan's phrase. And we'll see how much that verification is, how tough that is. And in this setting, I don't quite understand what containment absent their support gets us. On the other side of the equation is we always have the option of the hammer, which is, what we did in Iraq, which seems to, I think, would probably not generate a lot of U.S. public support right now. And so what are some of the other dynamics that are in play internally about what are some of the big questions you guys are raising? I'm not even looking for the answers. I want to get a sense as how you're trying to get your arms around what I don't think a single one of us up here would suggest if we were making the decision, would know with any degree of certainty exactly how to proceed either. So this is not instructive. I'm trying to get a sense of what the nature of the debate is internally and what are the questions that are being raised.
The nature of the debate, if I may, that's a great question. On the question of, I think you have to take each of the elements separately, first of all, then you come back to them. On the question of WMD, I think many of us are informed. I personally, from my own experience, I served in Iran during the time of the Shah when you were first coming up here, sir, or right after that. And even at that time, as you correctly point out, not only were they aspiring to have a nuclear weapon, but they were trying to have an overwhelming conventional. And they were not surrounded by threats. They were not. The Russians were working in the north. They were not surrounded by threats to their society. I believe that many of us feel that there's sort of an innate grandeur still in the dreams of Persepolis and all of that. So that informs part of the debate. So the WMD question might be harder than it seems because it might be more broad in society. Now, the question of terrorism is not. This is very, I believe, sui generis to post-revolution. And at the time, I think the Iranian revolutionaries started on this in Lebanon and through Syria, and the Quds Force and the IRGC has just gained in power, and in a way they're almost an automatic pilot and very detrimental. But that is not innate, I think, to Iran or to Persian society. There's the question of human rights, which is very interesting. Because at the time of the Shah, when many people would say it was the golden era, there was something called savak. Something called savak. And it would be a very rare senator indeed at the time who didn't vociferously criticize the activities and the violations of human rights of savak. So those are kind of the questions we wrestle with. Now, we find that there's nothing inherently contradictory about Shia Islam and democracy, and that appears to be what the Nobel Prize winner is saying as well. And so that also informs the debate. So that's where we're coming from. The idea of a grand bargain, I don't think that's on yet, because I think the questions are answered, each one of these questions is answered in a different way.
بله، سناتور جوزف بایدن که یکی از اعضای برجسته کمیته روابط خارجی سنای امریکا هست و اطلاعات گسترده‌ای در زمینه ایران داره، طی یک سوال طولانی بسیار خسته کننده به هر حال از آقای آرمیتاژ درباره سیاست‌های دولت امریکا در رابطه با ایران پرسش کرد و البته او این رو مطرح کرد که یکی از انتخاب‌های امریکا که شک داره امروز از اون اقبال عمومی برخوردار باشه همون شیوه‌ای است که آمریکا با عراق مواجه شد. اما آقای آرمیتاژ در پاسخ بسیار مختصر خودش در رابطه با سوال ولی جامع خودش اشاره کرد که در زمینه دستیابی به کشتار سلاح‌های کشتار جمعی در ایران دوران شاه هم این تمایلات وجود داشت، در حالی که ایران از هیچ نقطه‌ای تهدید نمی‌شد و در معرض هیچ گونه خطری نبود. آرمیتاژ میپذیره که تروریسم پدیده بعد از انقلاب ایران هست که این کار رو اینها در لبنان و سوریه آغاز کردن و در این رابطه میرسه به مسئله‌ای که مسئله حقوق بشر که امروز ما تا این حد بهش حساسیت داریم در دورانی که ما به دوران طلایی دوران شاه بهش اشاره میکنیم چندان مورد توجه نبود. ساواک رو به عنوان یک پدیده دوران پادشاهی ایران بهش اشاره میکنه و میگه که هرگز ما از ساواک و فعالیت‌های ساواک انتقاد جدی به عمل نیاوردیم و در این گفتگو بلافاصله کد میکنه در این بخش بدون اینکه اسم بیاره از خانم شیرین عبادی که میگوید شیرین عبادی معتقد است که امروز میشود در ایران به نوعی دموکراسی رسید و پیوندی از یک کشور شیعه و دموکراسی تضادی نمیبینه و امکان تحقق دموکراسی در این کشور رو میپذیرد. حالا برمیگردیم اگر داریا ما رو ببره به سناتور دیگری با هم گوش میدیم.
Iranian activity and terrorist activity for at least a period of time I've been in the Senate, traveled throughout Central Asia, mid-90s, late 90s, and the Iranians were very active in spreading terrorist cells up in that region at that time and continue to be. I would go into a number of countries coming out from the former Soviet Union that had a significant Islamic population, if not majority, and they were citing to the Iranians and the Saudis as planting community centers, mosques there, which were fine by them, but then out of that would come a radical element that would be organized, and they've been at this for some period of time and continue to be. There are a number of Iranian democracy advocates in this country and around the world. I've worked with a good portion of them. They would note very clearly to you, Iran is not a democracy. You've got a ruling guardian council that has to all the candidates have to go through. You have in essence, a religious ruler over the country. They support a referendum on Iranian governance and what's taking place within the Iranian society, and you're hearing more and more calls for that within Iranian society. I would hope that we could support as well that call for a referendum within the Iranian society, and note clearly Iran is not a democracy. We believe in democracy and human rights, and I would hope you could speak to that on the support for a referendum internally by the Iranian people on the future of Iranian governance.
Like I think most Americans, and certainly all of my colleagues at the Department of State, we were mesmerized by the vision of Shirin Ebadi receiving the Nobel Prize. We were fascinated by the spontaneity of the demonstration that greeted her when she returned to Iran. But I was even more interested in what she had to say. And what she had to say about developments in Iran and democracy, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't do it the eloquence, was basically that if we're going to have meaningful change, it has to come from within. I think she's on to something. It has to be something the majority of the people who live under the system embrace and see as a better way forward for them. If it's referendum, then that's fine. But I think I'm not able to, from the outside, to determine what the proper path exactly to transparency, elimination of corruption, whether it's political corruption or fiscal corruption, et cetera. I think what our best path and our best policy is to be very forthright in our views about transparency and governance and human rights, et cetera. Not to propagandize, but put out the information. Put it out constantly, because we're finding from what I think I called in my testimony, virtual embassies, we're finding Iranians who travel around coming in and tell us they're getting the message, they're hearing it. And rather than try to pick winners or losers in this, I don't think that's something we can do very well from the outside. But I think our duty, as well as our right, is to just put the facts on the table and call things as we see them about the need for civilized behavior in the world, et cetera. But whether it's a referendum or not, I think if that's what the majority of people want, I'm all for it. But I don't know where they are in their own development. We know there's intellectual and political ferment. There has not been, other than those student demonstrations of the summer, which were so horribly and brutally put down, there hasn't been sort of political activism yet. And I think they've got to come a ways internally before we'll know which direction they want to go.
We do know that Iran is a lead sponsor of terrorism. The leading sponsor of terrorism. And you note, which I found interesting, that that's an aberration from historical Iranian Persian society. So that's really with the mullahs that they've decided to go this route.
Sure.
And that's something we find abhorrent and just stand completely against.
Yes, sir.
I would also note there's a number of outside Iranians broadcasting inside and into Iran that are having their signals jammed at times, that the regime, I hope the State Department and our governmental apparatus are working with them to try to stop the places where that signal is getting jammed and help them, because it strikes me that one of the key things we can and should provide is information. And that information helps provide an organizational flow internally in Iran where they can't communicate. I've seen or heard of some of these operations where they're getting calls from inside Tehran to the radio station in the U.S. or another place of here's where we can organize to talk about right now, and then broadcasting it back into Iran because they can't internally organize without disruption, violation of human rights or risking really life and limb themselves. I would hope we could help more with that broadcasting and communication ability inside Iran.
My understanding of this, I won't go through the complete laundry list of what we as a government broadcast, but it's VOA. I saw some of the correspondence here. I've got a next chapter, a roundtable with youth, all these kind of things that we send in. Radio Farter, which is 24/7, a mixture of news, music, pop, to kind of keep people interested. The question of private groups broadcasting in, I think our preference on that is on a case-by-case basis, we will support under the MEPI. They're getting that information in. I'm not expert in these matters, but I know at one time, years ago with VOA, we had to be very careful about who was broadcasting into whatever country and who might be broadcasting for diaspora in our own country. And there were at least regulations and I believe rules about that. So I got the message, and I'll look into it for you and respond.
I appreciate it, because to me, Iran is a critical country in that region where we're on a stated policy of trying to drain the swamp and to provide open and free societies that can grow and prosper. And you've got one here that has an economy that's less than it was during the period of the Shah over, nearly 25 years ago. And, clearly I think Iran will make a vibrant, open, democratic society with quite a contribution to the world once it throws off the tyranny that sits on top of it. And I hope we can be as supportive as possible in that process. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
بله، سناتور برامبک که از اعضای شناخته شده سنای امریکاست، با نظراتش در مورد براندازی رژیم در ایران و در این مورد نظرات بسیار روشن و افراطی رو در رابطه با در مقایسه با سایر اعضای سنای امریکا داره، اشاره میکنه به این مطلب که ایرانی ها در آرزوی رفراندوم هستند و مایل هستند که در کشورشون رفراندومی انجام بشود و خواستار حمایت از این خواست مردم ایران است. ریچارد آرمیتاژ به نظر من بسیار هوشیارانه به این اظهار نظر سناتور امریکایی که شما البته اجزاشو توجه فرمودید، من اونچه که تونستم الان بنویسم اینجا دارم خدمتتون عرض میکنم، اشاره میکنه به این که از نظرات شیرین عبادی حمایت میکنه و در واقع خودش رو در پناه نظرات خانم شیرین عبادی برنده جایزه صلح نوبل قرار میدهد و اظهار نظری که او کرده درباره امکان آشتی بین دموکراسی و اسلام و اشاره میکنه به استقبال گسترده مردم از او و این که شیرین عبادی گفته است ما باید آماده تغییر باشیم و تغییر در ایران باید از تغییراتی باشه که از درون انجام بشه، یعنی از درون کشور. آرمیتاژ معتقد است که ما جز اینکه اطلاعات رو فراهم بکنیم و در اختیار مردم قرار بدیم کار زیاد دیگری ازمون ساخته نیست. اگر مردم در ایران رفراندوم رو میخواهند ما هم با انجام رفراندوم در ایران موافق هستیم، اما اشاره میکنه به این که اگر مردم چیزی کمتر از اون میخوان ما با اون کاری نمیتونیم بکنیم. به یک نکته بسیار اساسی در این پرسش و پاسخ اشاره میشه و اون است که ما به جز حرکت دانشجویان در ایران هیچ حرکت سازمان یافته و مشخصی رو شاهد و ناظر نیستیم و ندیدیم که در واقع بتونیم روی اون حساب تازه‌ای رو باز بکنیم. برامبک به قطع وسایل ارتباط جمعی که به طرف ایران برنامه پخش میکنند اشاره میکنه و اینکه اگر بشود کمک هایی کرد در این زمینه که این نوع امکانات توسعه پیدا بکنه و رشد پیدا بکنه. اجازه بفرمایید که چون اونچه که سناتور برامبک مطرح میکنه در دو پرسش بعدی سناتورهای امریکایی فکر میکنم دو پرسش باقی مانده هم اونها هم دنباله این پرسش رو به نحوی میگیرن، به اونها توجه کنید.
Get you to opine, given the recent agreement by Iran to suspend their development of nuclear weapons, an agreement with the Europeans, what appears to be in exchange for European economic help for Iran. I'd like for you to interpolate that as to whether or not it would work if we were to offer economic help in the same vein that the Europeans have.
What it is, it's off the record. There's never been any.
I kind of look at this, Senator, as sort of who needs to go first and who has been hiding the ball. And as the chairman indicated, Mr. Biden indicated, the Iranians have been caught out. They've been caught lying and hiding the ball several times. And most recently during a visit of the IAEA, when there were some traces of highly enriched uranium were found. They gave lie to all the things many of the things that the Iranians were saying. So my own view is we're the United States. We're not like everybody else, and we need to be very cautious and careful when we make decisions about economic assistance, et cetera, because you're sending a signal absent some rather basic agreement on other elements of policy with Iran, with which we have vehement objections, such as the terrorism and things of that nature that Senator Brownback was saying. So I think I would be pretty careful. Regarding the agreement, the apparent agreement, it appears that the Iranians have agreed to all the elements of the September 12th Board of Governors resolution. It's not just an agreement with the three ministers, though they were the ones who went to Tehran and received it. And the proof of that will be in the pudding, and we'll see. Dr. El-Baradei will issue a report after he's poured through the pages, the voluminous documentation. Then we will be consulting with the international community about the way forward as we go to the 20th and the 21st of November Board of Governors meeting.
Good people and good questions, and just like to be with you.
You were talking to Senator Brownback about the jamming. There was a report that the Cuban government was jamming broadcast into Iran at a time that when students were protesting the oppression by the ruling clerics. What do you know about that?
We approached the government of Cuba about some jamming that was emanating from Cuba. It was not the government of Cuba. It was another entity, and it has ceased.
Somehow we got named on the Cuban policy.
Since Iran is such a sponsor and benefactor of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is clearly an impediment to the interest of the United States in reaching a peace accord in the Middle East, plus the fact that there are substantial presence of Hezbollah here in the United States. What contacts, if any, or have been with the government of Iran about their sponsorship of Hezbollah? And if none, what do we plan in the future?
Well, what we have done, first of all, there's no need on this issue for someone to send a private message. Everybody from the U.S. Senate to successive presidents have been very clear from the time of Ronald Reagan on about Hezbollah-Iranian marriage. We try to complicate and constrict the ability of Iran to provide aid and comfort to Hezbollah. We try this by stopping of overflights or trying to jawbone countries into not allowing overflights when weapons are going to be delivered through Syria or something of that nature. We do it by trying to stop flows of money, which is a much more difficult thing because it can go 360 degrees and still find its way back to Hezbollah. We work with the terrorist financing resolution at the UN to try to constrict and control Hezbollah's access to funds. It's a pretty difficult thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your service. It's pretty inspiring for somebody new like me to be able to listen to somebody like you who's been there a long time. But you're never talking about yesterday. You're also
making me
talking
feel
about
like
tomorrow.
I got a lot of moss on my tusks.
Let me first, if I may, just want to follow up on the Middle East, the situation with Israel and terrorism. And I share the opinion of my colleague from Kansas, this is a difficult situation, and I'm sure my colleague from New Hampshire, from Rhode Island, when he was discussing concern about what's happening with the building of some barriers, that there's not an equivalency between Iran supporting Hezbollah, which is supporting killing of Israelis, killing of Americans, of allies of America. I'm clear there's no moral equivalency there. Iran is supporting terrorism. There's no question about that. The second piece of that, then, just to finish the discussion about the Middle East for a second, that portion of it, in terms of U.S. policy, our policy is the establishment of a Palestinian state, but the precondition of that still stands to what the President said on June 24th, that an end to terrorism is a precondition. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
If we can just talk about a follow-up with a comment that Senator Nelson raised about the jamming of the signals to Iran. I had a chance to be in Cubans, and the Cubans very, very forthright. They said we didn't do it, and others did it. You said other entity. Can you identify who that other entity was? Was it Iranian
yes,
officials? So the Iranians were jamming the ability of folks.
And it has ceased.
Okay, appreciate that. Let me just one other question then. How do you? We know that the efforts in democracy in Iran, they rise up, the students rise up, and they get crushed. They were crushed brutally a number of years ago. They continue to be crushed. How do you support democracy? What is it that we're not doing today that will be more helpful in supporting a more democratic Iran?
You know, the student riots to which you refer, Senator, as I understand it, actually came about not in a search for democracy, but they were demonstrating against the fact that the universities were going to be privatized, and the tuition would dramatically rise. And that developed over some time, a couple of days, to need for more openness in society and democracy, et cetera. And, of course, as we indicated, was brutally crushed. I think our job in this, we can't force something on people who want it less than we do. So I think, and as I say, I was very moved by Ms. Shirin Ebadi's comments about meaningful change has to come from within. And the intellectual and political ferment, I think, has to be translated into louder and more demands for freedoms. We have heard, it's not a state secret, that recently the Parliament, the Majlis, has passed laws having to do with more judicial openness, et cetera. Now, these laws were contravened by the unelected body, the Council of Guardians. But that kind of expression, I think, speaks to what is underlying most peoples in the world. That is a basic desire to run their own lives. Our job in this, I think, is to make, first of all, the facts available. And the facts are both positive facts and negative facts. Positive facts about how countries around the world are developing their own democracies, and, for instance, some of the countries in the former Soviet Union who, in relative terms, have come quite far in 10 or 12 years. Also the negative facts, that is how Iran is perceived in the world, why Iranians have difficulty getting visas, those who are able to travel, why, when we talk about corruption, just who's doing what to whom. Those kind of things. So I think that's our job right now, and that would allow, I think, the political ferment to take hold.
Last question, if I have the time, just to touch upon the issue of Iran and developing its nuclear capacity. How do we avoid the pitfalls of in U.S. policy towards arming Iran with our policy toward North Korea in 1994? How do you avoid the situation where somebody says that they're going to negotiate, they're going to sign an agreement, they're not going to go down this track, but when they have the record that they have had, when they have certainly, as you indicated, the record of support for terrorism, we can't afford to have what happened with North Korea happen with Iran. How do we avoid those pitfalls?
My own view, it's a good lesson. There's something that we need to keep our eyes on. I go into this saying our enthusiasm for Bushehr, for instance, the so-called civil nuclear action is very much under control because they haven't. The Iranians haven't demonstrated their bona fides in terms of the NPT. They would say to you, the Iranians, that we have an inalienable right as an NPT signatory to civilian nuclear use. Well, that's not quite right. They have an inalienable right if they're living up to all the criteria in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has to do with eschewing nuclear weapons and enriched uranium and plutonium reprocessing for weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've got to spend some time calling them, making them live up to their bona fides. And second of all, I think unlike North Korea, this is a nation awash in energy. The fourth largest reserves of petroleum, the second largest in gas. So for them to say they need civilian nuclear reactors seems to me to be a bit incredulous. And I
در خدمتتون هستم. یک بار دیگه تلاش کردم در این چند دقیقه گوشه هایی از جلسه سنای امریکا رو برای شما پخش بکنم. شاید اگر فرصتی باشد تلویزیون آپادانا در هفته آینده وقتی رو برای پخش کامل این جلسه اختصاص بدهد بشود این کار رو کرد و امیدوارم که بخشی از پرسش پاسخ ها رو با تفصیل بیشتری در حضور آقای دکتر فرهنگ و دکتر بینا هفته آینده در محل تلویزیون به بحث بگذاریم. سناتور نلسون در واقع از سناتور دموکرات از فلوریدا جوهر صحبتش این بود که اختلال امواج ارتباطی که روی اون بسیار حساب میکنند آیا در کوبا توسط دولت کوبا انجام شده؟ آقای آرمیتاژ پاسخ داد که خیر، بلکه دیگری مسئول بوده، یک آیدنتیتی دیگه مسئول بوده، اما روشن نکرد. در رابطه با کاهش روابط حزب الله و دولت ایران، آرمیتاژ در پاسخ سوال و اظهار نظر سناتور نلسون گفت که ما سعی می‌کنیم از طریق قطع ارتباط‌های هوایی و پایین آوردن سطح کمک‌های مالی و قطع اونها بتوانیم در این مورد اثرگذار باشیم. آخرین پرسش کننده سناتور کولمن بود که درباره اختلال امواج ارتباطی تلویزیون‌ها و وسایل ارتباط جمعی رو به ایران سوال کرد و آرمیتاژ در این مرحله ناچار شد در واقع بپذیره، چون دو بار اسم این آیدنتیتی رو نیاورده بود، که این اختلال توسط ایران در داخل کوبا انجام شده است. و کولمن به طور خیلی مشخصی پرسید که شما برای اینکه صحبت از حمایت از دموکراسی در ایران میکنید واقعا چطور میخواید این دموکراسی رو انجام بدید؟ آرمیتاژ باز اشاره کرد به جنبش دانشجویان که و آخرین حرکت دانشجویان در اعتراض به خصوصی کردن دانشگاه‌ها و بالا بردن میزان شهریه در دانشگاه‌ها که در کنار اون خواستار جامعه بازتری شدن. البته من اشاره کرده بودم این جمله رو که میخوام بگم به سناتور دیگری که اشتباه بود، ولی در واقع در پاسخ به سناتور کولمن بود که آرمیتاژ گفتش که ما مردم رو نمیتوانیم وادار به خواستن چیزی بکنیم که از اون چی که ما فکر میکنیم کمتره. یعنی وقتی مردم خواستها و مطالبات کمتری دارن ما اونها رو نمیتونیم وادار به مطالبات بیشتر بکنیم. باز هم اشاره میکنه به گفته های خانم شیرین عبادی و اینکه باید صداهای خواستار تغییر در ایران رو به افزایش بره و تا اینکه بشود اصلاحات بیشتری در داخل ایران انجام بشود و واقع بیموندن و نگاه کردن به فکت ها و عوامل مثبت و منفی رو در رابطه با ایران. آرمیتاژ توصیه میکنه که سناتورها به اون توجه بکنن، به خصوص در رابطه با توسعه سلاح‌های اتمی در ایران که مسئله روس هست. اما اجازه بفرمایید که در این دقایق اگر شما پرسشی داشته باشید پرسشون میتونید مطرح بفرمایید، اگر نه اجازه بفرمایید که من آماده بشم بعد از پخش این قسمت، برای اینکه خانم دکتر مهرانگیز کار به من خبر دادن که تشریف آوردن و در محل استودیوی تلویزیون آپادانا هستن. ما به یک قطعه موسیقی گوش کنیم، آگهی‌های تجارتی تلویزیون رو شما ببینید و من از خانم دکتر مهرانگیز کار، بانوی فعال در زمینه حقوق بشر، دعوت بکنم که تشریف بیارن در محل استودیو و گفتگوی خودم رو با ایشون آغاز کنم. با ما باشید. امیدوارم